Welcome. Welcome to CAEF's webinar, Understanding Jewish Indigeneity, with two very special and I would say very patient guests, whose knowledge and experience makes them especially competent to speak on this topic. I'm Andrea Spindle, Executive Director of the Canadian Antisemitism Education Foundation, and I'm really thrilled to be engaging with you on this topic. Knowing Jewish history, including that of Israel, has never been more important for Jews and non-Jews than at this time in history, when our enemies are many and they're very active and well-funded and utilize every propaganda tool known in the modern world to deny history, to erase Jews from the land of Israel, and pathologically write a false version of history. The battle over the land of Israel is being played out on social and traditional media, on university campuses, and even in high schools, and among faith communities, political parties, corporate brands, and by celebrities. Knowing the meaning of indigeneity, the facts about Jewish indigeneity in Israel and Jewish legal rights will help arm us for this fierce and unrelenting propaganda war. I want to thank the Canadian Institute of Jewish Research for partnering with us and the many co-sponsors of this webinar, including, and I'm going to read them because I really do want to thank them. This is really important. These partnerships are very important. Addith Israel Congregation, Americans for Peace and Tolerance, Americans for a Safe Israel, the Atlanta Israel Coalition, the Council for Muslims Against Antisemitism, the Combat Antisemitism Movement, End Jew Hatred Canada, International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, Hasbara Fellowships Canada, La'ad, J-Teach, Kulanu Canada, Cherut Canada, Muslims Facing Tomorrow, NCSY Canada, Beit Raim Congregation, Jewish Resistance, the Lodger Congregation, the Lawfare Project, North Carolina Coalition for Israel, the Toronto Zionist Council, UK Lawyers for Israel, European Lawyers for Israel, Club Z, Club Z, Rhode Island Coalition for Israel, Doctors Against Racism and Antisemitism, and the Indigenous Coalition for Israel. The fact that we have over 24 support organizations tells us a lot about the importance of this topic. Just a month ago or so, I read a most interesting article in Tablet magazine that perhaps many of you saw. I hope some of you are familiar with it. Dr. Sheree Trotter spoke of the attributes that establish a people as Indigenous, and then noted shared values and traditions of the Maori people and the Jewish people in regards to their land, language, history, and more. Dr. Trotter is quoted in the article as having said, and I quote, "Despite what anti-Zionist ideologues might assume, the Jews of Israel are an inspiration for many Maori." She went on to say that, and I quote, "When a Maori person reads the genealogies in the Tanakh, it resonates with the practice that is kept alive in Maori gatherings, where much of the speech making revolves around, and I may pronounce it incorrectly, wakapapa, recounting genealogy to establish the connections between peoples." I know you will all be as odd on hearing Sheree speak as I was on reading this article. Dr. Trotter is Maori and holds a PhD in history from the University of Auckland. Her thesis was on Zionism. In 2012, she co-founded the Holocaust and Antisemitism Foundation at Aotearoa, New Zealand. Sheree is a researcher and writer whose areas of special interest include New Zealand, Jewish, and Maori history. Several years ago, while I was looking for amazing speakers to host in Toronto, I came across a video called "Why I Am a Zionist" by then member of the New Zealand Parliament, the Honorable Alfred Ngaro. This was a time when, if you can recall, we actually had in-person events with people sitting together in chairs, looking attentively at a guest keynote speaker. At that time, I wrote a note to myself to follow up and invite him to speak and to bring him to Toronto. Well, that time didn't happen, so I am delighted that we could do it this way via Zoom. Alfred Ngaro is a New Zealand-born Cook Islander. He was a member of the New Zealand House of Representatives from 2011 to 2020 and was the first Cook Islander elected to Parliament in New Zealand. As an MP, Alfred re-established the Parliamentary Friends of Israel group. He served as a cabinet minister and was an active advocate on social issues. Sheree and Alfred are co-founders and directors of the Indigenous Coalition for Israel, which I'm sure they will tell us about. And with me today is Machla Abramovitz, Publications Manager for the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research, which is our partner for this webinar. Machla is co-editor with Nathan Elberg of the book, Zionism, an Indigenous Struggle, Aboriginal Americans and the Jewish State. Machla will handle the question and answer period following the presentations. You may enter your questions using the Q&A function in your Zoom screen. And note, this program is being recorded and will be posted and will be distributed to everybody who has registered. So thank you for joining us today. And I now invite Sheree to make a presentation.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I'd like to thank the hosts of this event and all the sponsors that you've mentioned. I think it's absolutely amazing that you've hosted this. Now I'm just going to begin with a traditional kind of way of introducing myself, which is called a pepeha in Māori. I'm going to keep it quite brief, but I will introduce myself that way and explain it, and then I'll do the screen share of our presentation, which I'll try and keep to the time limit. So, ko nongataha toku maunga, ko rotorua nui kahu matamomoe, toku roto, ko tūhaurangi, Ngāti Whakaue, tapuika Ngāti Moko, oku iwi, ko Aotearoa, te waka, ko taituha rota, toku koro, ko rangi mahuta roiha renati, toku kuia, ko Dagvin, toku papa, ko Reria Bean, toku mama, ko Peri, toku tāne rangatira, ko Sheree, toku ingoa. So that is a traditional kind of introduction when we're in formal style meetings and we're introducing who we are. And what I've just told you, and beginning from the top, is that my mountain is Ngātaha, my waterway is Lake Rotorua. These are my tribes, and I listed 3 of the tribes that I belong to. I mentioned my grandparents on one side and my parents on the other side. And this is the traditional kind of introduction. And I think you can see in that introduction how these aspects of connection to land and ancestors is so important to Indigenous people. And as Andrea mentioned, we see the resonance with Jewish culture, that there's very much a connection to land and to ancestors. And these are 2 aspects of indigeneity, which I think are very marked features. So I'm going to do the screen share now. So this is the talk today, Understanding Jewish Indigeneity. And if you might be interested to go to our website at the Indigenous Coalition, where we are gathering materials on this topic, and we've got a few interesting articles there, and we will be adding more material that just helps to build the understanding of the indigeneity of the Jewish people. This is the outline for the next 20 minutes. I've already just done the introduction, the pepeha. So I'm going to briefly talk about the background to this debate, why it matters, defining Jews as indigenous to Israel, and briefly touch on some of the critics of the indigenous argument. So we've done the pepeha, the introduction, and I've explained a little bit about that and the resonances between our culture and Jewish culture. Now, the background to the debate, I think it's really come from academia, is where it's begun, and it's spread out from academia into politics, into popular media. And as has been mentioned, I've been at university for the last few years working on my PhD, which was Zionism in New Zealand, and a fascinating topic. If anyone's interested, contact me through the website and I can send you my thesis. But it became very evident to me in the discipline of history that I was in, just the dominance of the post-colonial narrative. And Edward Said was really a key figure in the development of this narrative. And of course, he was a Palestinian, American Palestinian, while his father gained American citizenship, and he was educated largely in America, elsewhere as well, but he was a professor of literature at Columbia University. And I think it's interesting to note that he was a professor of literature and not of history. I think that's quite significant. But his book, Orientalism, in 1978, he really paved the way for this idea of the other, and the way that Western scholarship had portrayed the Eastern peoples, the Arabs, as other and as less than and as exotic. He was influenced by the likes of Foucault, who was also a really significant figure, because Foucault had this idea of power relationships being at the center of the way we view history and the way we view society. So these kind of ideas have really infiltrated academia, and I think it's had a real impact on the Israel-Palestinian debate. So Edward Said also wrote The Question of Palestine and The Politics of Dispossession, and he very skillfully created this picture of the Palestinians as the oppressed and Israel as the oppressors. So I think Foucault's significance needs to be noted here. I mean, this is very brief, of course. Fast forward to last year, and Rashid Khalidi, who's a historian, Palestinian historian, wrote The 100 Years' War on Palestine. And by this stage, it's just assumed that Palestinians are the indigenous people. I will read to you what he says in this book. He says, "The modern history of Palestine can best be understood in these terms as a colonial war waged against the indigenous population by a variety of parties to force them to relinquish their homeland to another people against their will." So this has come from academia, and this is what has infiltrated into popular media, and it's become the accepted narrative. So I just want to note that these ideas have been rebutted by historians like Benny Morrison, and you can see here what he's written, that rather than Israel being an imperial power or Zionism being an imperial power, acquiring political control over another country, settling it with its sons and exploiting it economically, Zionism was rather a movement of desperate idealistic Jews from Eastern and Central Europe bent on immigration to a country that had once been populated and ruled by Jews, not another country regaining sovereignty over it. The settlers were not the sons of an imperial power, and the settlement enterprise was never designed to politically or strategically serve an imperial mother country or economically exploit it on behalf of any empire. The land was known to lack natural resources. And I think I've just read to you the next quote, have I? No, I haven't. So I think he effectively, Benny Morris, Derek Penslar, there are others, they point out the problems with this idea of the all-powerful Israelis dispossessing the indigenous Palestinian population. But it's been very pervasive, and social and political activists have picked up on the narrative. And in the New Zealand context, we, in our history of activism, which of course is connected to the Māori political movement, this is from the 80s, and it was at the time when New Zealand opposed the apartheid of South Africa. And this was quite a big moment in New Zealand's history because you may or may not know, but rugby's a big deal in New Zealand, and some would say it's our national religion, certainly our national game. So it was quite acrimonious, the sort of debates in families over the Springboks coming to New Zealand. So the Springboks being the South African rugby team that came, I think it was 1981. And so there were massive protests at this time, the anti-apartheid movement. And of course that was successful. But what happened from there, and it was connected to the international Black rights movement. But what happened with that was when that was resolved, it moved on to a pro-Palestinian movement, and the ideas were just translated from anti-apartheid to pro-Palestinian. And one of the leaders of that movement is still carrying on that fight today. So these ideas have spread out into social and political activism, and also have been promoted by Palestinian politicians. But we do have to recognise that the Palestinian leaders didn't always see it this way. So just a couple of quotes from early history: the mayor of Jerusalem saying, "Who can contest the rights of the Jews regarding Palestine? Good Lord, historically it is really your country." And this other one from 1919. "We wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. The Jewish movement is national and not imperialist." So, the early Arab population didn't necessarily see the Palestinians. In fact, they didn't see the Palestinians as Indigenous people. That wasn't the language of the time. And the leaders recognised the Jewish connection and the rightness of the Jewish return. But if we fast forward again to 2016, and the Palestinian Foreign Minister, this was in opposition to the Balfour Declaration, and he was proposing that they sue the British government for the Balfour Declaration. And the quote here: "The British were complicit in the historic crime of the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine at the expense of the indigenous Arabs who had lived for thousands of years on the soil of their homeland." So again, this is the narrative that is being repeated and reinforced from different angles. And in New Zealand, it has very much become part of the mainstream media. And this was last year during the war with Gaza. And one of the news presenters made this comment, she said, "It sounds maybe a tiny bit like colonisation, a tiny bit familiar to me as a Māori person in New Zealand. Would that be fair, or is it a totally different ballgame?" So I wrote to this presenter, Kanoa, and said, no, it's not a tiny bit like colonisation. And I tried to explain, the situation with Gaza. But again, this is just another example of the fact that there's this narrative that is accepted as mainstream. And this is why it matters. This is why the question of who are the Indigenous people matters, because it's been so accepted as mainstream, because it's been so politicised. So the commonly accepted narrative is that Israel is a settler colonialist state where foreign Zionists invaded and dispossessed the so-called Indigenous Palestinians. To sum up, that is the narrative, which of course is a false historical construct. And I say construct intentionally because it is being constructed by picking and choosing which bits of history that you want to prefer. So historically, it's full of inaccuracies, it's revisionism, it politicizes history, and by necessity has to twist the facts to fit the model. So it's highly selective in its treatment of the details and the facts. So that's the narrative. It's false. It's used to demonize Israel, and it leads to anti-Semitism. So, I mean, I probably wouldn't say that all anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but you can certainly say that much anti-Zionism leads to anti-Semitism, and there's definitely a crossover there. So this demonization of Israel, aside from its basis in falsehood, I believe is a major contributor to anti-Semitism, and it's used as a political weapon to delegitimize Israel. And as an example, and we know the UN is always doing this, but the UN's recent attack on Israel in their recent Jerusalem resolution is an example of that they're not only neglecting to use the Hebrew name, but they are trying to deny any of Israel's claims on Jerusalem. The Jerusalem resolution that was just passed, it asserts that, quote, any actions taken by Israel, the occupying power, to impose its laws, jurisdiction, administration on the holy city of Jerusalem are illegal. So, you know, the UN is politicizing this issue of indigeneity and using it to try and undermine any Jewish connection to Jerusalem. So this is why I believe that understanding the indigeneity of the Jews is so important. And so we'll move on to this next section where I'll just talk a little bit about that, about the indigeneity of the Jews. So there's no set definition, but the UN has come up with a formulation which has been generally accepted as a set of criteria to identify who Indigenous people are. And there's the list there, which I'm sure many of our viewers will be quite familiar with. In essence, indigeneity describes the ethnogenesis of a people group within a particular land, and it's within that land that their unique culture, practices, religion, and language has developed. So for Jewish people, that place is Israel. It's Judea, Samaria, it's Jerusalem. And, you know, we could go through each of these aspects and show the examples. And I've got a couple of quotes that kind of summarize it. On our website, I've recently published an article by Michael Jacobson, who compares the Jewish people with the Cherokee people. And he brings out some really interesting aspects of this and Jewish connection to land, and shows how traditional Jewish life has at all times and in all places been oriented around the land of Israel, that despite generations of exile, Jews have always felt a profound spiritual connection to their ancestral land. He points out the way that the Jewish calendar follows its seasonal rhythms, and the way that the year is punctuated by festivities that correspond to agricultural milestones. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that. He also talks about the ethno-botanical traditions and social, economic, and political systems. So one or two points I would make about this is that the continuous presence, I think, is a really important aspect of Jewish indigeneity, that there's always been a Jewish presence in the land, even though at times it's been very small. And from a Māori perspective, we have a phrase for that called ahika, which means to keep the fires burning. And it was this idea that there could be a remnant of a tribe who will stay on a piece of land to keep the fires burning, to keep their ownership in that land, basically. And again, this is where, you know, as Indigenous people, we can see the resonances between our culture and Jewish culture in some of these ways and practices and ideas and beliefs. Of course, we know that there's genetic evidence today connecting Jews back to the land. There's historic evidence, there's archaeological evidence. This one about forming non-dominant groups of society. So a few people I've talked to have said that that was added later intentionally to exclude Jews. I don't know what the evidence is for that, but in my way of thinking, and as I wrote in my article, it seems really out of place with the other points, which are all intrinsic values of Indigenous people, whereas forming a non-dominant group is really an external factor and it's a political factor, and I don't see how that really defines who you are as Indigenous. So in other words, you know, if Māori managed to regain sovereignty in Aotearoa, New Zealand, would we no longer be Indigenous? I don't think so. We would still be Indigenous. Of course, Fiji is an example that's often referred to. They have retained this, regained their sovereignty, and they still are classed as Indigenous peoples. So just a couple of quotes here from Alan Hertz, and I just want to say hello, Alan. I saw your name there, and I really appreciate your article. And he points out that of all extant peoples, Jews have the strongest claim to be the Aboriginal people of Eretz Israel. They're the language developed, Judaism emerged. And the connection to the immediate ancestors, Saul, David, Solomon. So there were these other local peoples, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, but they're no longer surviving. And this is a key point, you know, of the existing people connected to that land. We have the Jewish people today. And another quote about peoplehood, and peoplehood is a really important aspect of indigeneity. And I think this is where I've noticed a lot of Jewish people struggle to see themselves as Indigenous, because they're very individualistic in their frame of thinking or their outlook. Indigenous people think of themselves very much as part of a people group. So this quote, while many Jews did not define themselves as Zionists, they always viewed themselves as a people. Even the earliest sacred sources insist they constitute a people, a chosen people, bound together by a covenant with the Lord. And this is something that the Palestinians have tried to avoid by saying that the Jews are not a people. So Palestinian nationalism chose to define Jews as a faith community rather than as a people. And this idiosyncratic view is entrenched in and embodies Palestinian rejectionism, does not acknowledge how Jews understood themselves over millennia, and ignores the fact that the Nazis and their accomplices determined to eradicate the entire Jewish people as a race, not individuals with a particular religious identity. So what about the Arabs? Are they Indigenous? That's certainly the claim that they are making. This was from a document put out by the Arabs in 2006. We, the Palestinian Arabs, are the Indigenous people, the residents of the State of Israel, and an integral part of the Palestinian people and the Arab and Muslim and human nation. It further asserts that the Palestinian Arabs are the sole long resident population with rights over the land, while the Jews are recent foreign conquerors. Well, this is simply not true. As we know, that the Jews are not Indigenous to this tiny little piece of Israel, what we now call Israel, but Indigenous to Arabia, and that's where their distinct culture developed. And so Jewish residents in the land of Israel predated Arabs by at least millennia. And, you know, the Arab people traditionally did not claim to be Indigenous to Israel. The Quran, for example, says that Allah had promised the Holy Land to the Jews, all of whom would return there by Judgment Day. So at least 1,000 years before the ethnogenesis of Arabs in Arabia, self-identified Jewish people had been established already in Israel. So, you know, what they do is they de-indigenize the Jews and assert themselves, and assert themselves as the Indigenous people, and thereby wiping out Jewish history. And it just requires a denial of recorded history and the physical evidence, as well as all the other evidence. So I've noticed in recent times that there's been a bit of pushback on the Indigenous argument, which is interesting. I think it shows perhaps that the Indigenous argument is making some headway. And, you know, I really want to acknowledge some of those who've been at the forefront of this, like Ryan Bellerose, who was probably the first Indigenous person I heard putting forth these arguments. And you've got, you know, groups like Indigenous Bridges in America and Canada, and my friends over in Australia, Norman and Barbara Miller, have the Indigenous Friends of Israel. And I know that there are a lot of youth movements now who are really claiming their Indigenous status as Jews, young Jewish activists who are declaring themselves Indigenous and really pushing that on social media platforms like Instagram. And so the fact that there's been this pushback is not necessarily a negative thing. So Abe Silberstein was his name, has published a couple of articles recently where he calls in the Indigenous argument bio-Zionism, which I think really just shows his lack of understanding of indigeneity, and that he's reduced it all to biology, which it's not. You know, indigeneity is much broader and more expansive than simply genetics. Certainly ethnicity is a part of it, and certainly connection to ancestors is really important, but it's much broader than that. It's the development of a whole culture, religious practices within a particular land, and Judaism, as well as Māori culture, and I'm sure most Indigenous cultures, have ways for others to become included as part of the tribe, as it were. In Māori culture, we have a practice of adoption, of whāngai, where people can come in and become part of your tribe, and you don't have to have any genetic connection at all. And I know that's there in Judaism as well. So to call it and reduce it to bio-Zionism is really very simplistic and shows a lack of understanding of what indigeneity really is. And of course, settler colonialism, Silverstein recently, I think just this week, has published an article with what's his name, Veracini, I think, Lorenzo Veracini, who is one of the leaders of the settler colonial ideology. And I'll call it an ideology because that's really what it is. It's a political construct, it's a political framework which is plastered over the history, and history really collapses in the process. Even in that article, he comes out with these blanket statements which are just false if you look at it historically. It doesn't allow for the contingencies, for the nuance of history, for the fact that history, and certainly the history of Zionism, unfolded, and it was very dependent on the situation around it, which it had no control over. So, I mean, that's a whole big topic in itself that we don't have time for today. So that's my brief kind of quick fire lightning overview of the Indigenous argument and why I think it's important, and I think why we as Indigenous people, we see Jewish culture and practices and beliefs, and we see the resonances as Indigenous people, and we want to get in behind and support the Jewish people as Indigenous people because we see the battle as well that Jewish people face today. And I would mention that in New Zealand with the Māori culture, Jews have always been an inspiration. Actually, in the 19th century, there were a lot of prophetic Māori movements that developed because of the inspiration of the Israelites, of the Old Testament in particular. And Māori who were struggling against colonization found inspiration in the models in the Bible, and actually many saw themselves as Israelites, and Moses as their leader, etc. So Jewish story, Jewish history, Jewish people have always been an inspiration to Māori people, and that's why we've set up the Indigenous Coalition. Really, it's just to emphasise this message and to join with other Indigenous peoples to support the Jewish people. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheree. That was terrific. And I won't get into the question that might be in people's minds right now, whether or not the Maori are a lost tribe of Israel. I'm sure you get asked that, but we won't get into that today. Thank you so much. That was very enlightening. And I'll now ask Alfred to speak.
Kia rana tātou katoa tō tōru mātua tito, no te iri mi tātou ki tiu pōni. Greetings to everyone. So my name is Alfred Ngaro, and even though we say we're Cook Island Māori, because our migration stories relate from the Pacific region to Aotearoa to New Zealand as well. So our language is very similar. When we say the word kia ora or kia rana, it doesn't just mean hello, and it's like when we say, I suppose, shalom. It's actually not just a hello greeting. It's a sense of like baruch. It's a blessing, right, that you want to give to people. And so kia rana actually means that you wish people well. May you live long. May you live well. And so that's the greeting that comes with that as well. So I give that to you. I want to acknowledge Andrea, Makla, and David as well, that are here, that are helping to support the session. I want to acknowledge all the people that have actually chosen to log in and to be able to be part of the seminar, because it has a lot of relevance and importance to who we are as people as well. And as both Andrea and Sheree, want to acknowledge all the sponsors that are here, because that becomes really important. It's one thing to be able to have an idea, but those who can back it up by resourcing, supporting it, those things become really important. And so I want to acknowledge all of your efforts and your support as well. So my background is from construction. My background is also in theology. My background also too is in politics. And so there are different elements to that as well. But as Sheree, what is Indigenous to us, which is also Indigenous, I believe, to many cultures, we just don't give it a name of Indigeneity, because Indigeneity is often looked at predominantly people who are more brown colored or colored, to be honest. That's what often we see it as, but in different parts of the world, it's a little bit different. And so therefore it has a different view to it. And so for us, our culture, we call it our whakapapa. In Cook Island Māori, we say akapapa, but really it's about our genealogy. And Indigeneity is about identity. That's at the heart of it. Who are we? To whom do we belong? Where do we reside? What is our sense of purpose? That's what Indigeneity really is all about. And if we have a framework like that, then we begin to approach all the things around us in life and in our communities and our society in the same way. And I would say that it's no different to what I suppose those who oppose Israel and its indigeneity are trying to do the same thing too. They're in a quest to try and, I suppose, find their sense of identity. It just so happens that in some cases, people try to change history, they try to change dominance for their own ends. So for me, just as a way of background, I was born in New Zealand. We have a saying, taku pito, which is we call it our afterbirth, was actually, so in our culture, when a child is born, after the child is born, the afterbirth actually is then put into the land. And so we call it a pito, and we say taku pito, ki ruta te inua, ki ruta te whenua, inside the land. And it's a symbolic way of saying that now this is another generation that belongs to this land and to its people. And so there's a significance in that we're actually now connected symbolically as well. And, I just love what Sheree was saying, which is that, and I've seen some of the chats about archaeology, history, all of those things. What do they tell? They tell a history of a people that have actually sown themselves into the land and into its people. And so to me, that's critically important. And in one sense, it's undeniable. And so I think that's important. So I was born in New Zealand. My afterbirth is in New Zealand. But I want to say that both my parents came from the Cook Islands, but my grandmother, she was Jewish. And her name was Rita Goldstein. Now, you can't get much more Jewish than that. But so I grew up in a culture where I had both this culture that she was teaching me and this Indigenous culture. However, for my grandmother, she didn't grow up in a Jewish community because her father was Marcus Goldstein, and he was in the Pacific, married my great-grandmother. And he passed away earlier when she was young. So she never got the chance. But for our culture, the identification of where you come from, who your father and who your mother is, who your grandparents are, significantly important. And the reasons for that, I want to say to you, is that for us, we're very proud of our Jewish ancestry, to the point that the youngest of my 4 children is called Shalom. Now, in saying that, he's not peaceful, but it comes, as many of you know, from the root of Shalem, which means to be whole. He was the last of our children. I personally wanted 9 children, but my wife said we could only have 4, which is great. So he was our Shalem. He completed our family. And so that becomes really important to us. And so I'm saying this to you because part of what drives me and my commitment, and I know Sheree as well, is that this sense of Zionism, indigeneity, it's actually a love of the people and the love of the place. This is not just in a sense that we sort of, for me, it came up, well, this is a great idea. So therefore, it's actually ingrained inside of who I am. And hence the reasons why everything that I do actually is in response from very much a personal perspective in what I'm putting forward as well, and drives a lot of that in what I'm doing. So the topic I've just been given, and I'm just going to briefly cover this, I'm really looking forward to some of the questions that are coming forward, is about Indigenous approaches to building alliances and influencing decision makers. And I've been involved in a number of leadership situations. And as Andrew said, that when I was in Parliament and in politics, I re-established the Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group of New Zealand. And I have to say to you, even in little old New Zealand, there were those who opposed this. They were opposed. And what I find really interesting is that there's a lot of people who are trafficking in what I call unfelt truth, but also to, in one sense, not knowing the truth of the circumstance or the situation about a people. And that's why it becomes important that there's such an importance of a vigilance of actually continuing to tell those stories. And so one of the things I tell people about, they often say, well, why Israel? What is it about Israel? And I can tell about my genealogy, my whakapapa, but I also tell from, and I love this from the biblical perspective, where from Genesis chapter 12, and I love this because this is where the Abrahamic Accord, and we know it at the moment, between the Abraham Accord that's inside in the Middle East, but it talks about a covenant about people. And what I love about this is that, so here is a covenant that's being made with Abraham, with God, and saying this is that, you will be a great nation, and I will make you a nation, and your purpose is to be a blessing to others. It also has a precursor to say that, and I will curse those who curse you. But I love the part that then it says that, and you will be a blessing, your family, and in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So I just want to say that one of the things I'm always wanting to put forward, in a sense, the presentation, is that it's not just about looking at Israel as a problem to be solved. Actually, it's a potential to be realized. And I tell you, I'd like to say that I coined that myself, but it actually came from my grandmother. And when I was young, and sometimes I'd be naughty, and I know most of you would look at my face and say, oh, that doesn't look the face of someone who could be naughty, but apparently I was when I was young. And my parents used to say to me, oh, you're just a naughty boy, you're a problem child. But my grandmother said, no, you're not a problem for them to solve, you're a potential to be realized. So she spoke a blessing into my life. And I have to say, that has held me many times when I've even doubted myself and others have doubted me. I keep reminding myself, I'm not a problem to be solved, I'm a potential to be realized. And so everything that I've then put forward in regards to the approaches around building alliances, establishing Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group, is not just about solving the problem that people may impose upon a nation and its people. Actually, it's about what is the blessing that I believe that a nation was birthed on, to be a blessing to other nations and to other people. And I just believe that we need to not be caught up in a narrative that tries to define who we are. We're not defined by the narratives of other people. We should be defined by the sense of knowing who we are as a people. And so I take that really importantly. And so when I was establishing and part of holding the Israeli Parliamentary Friendship Group, it wasn't just trying to convince those who were pro-Palestinian about Israel. Actually, it's about showing what Israel could offer to the nation and to its people in business and ingenuity. What I loved about going to Israel was when I remember I met with some of the leaders of the innovation in Israel being the startup capital of the world. And I said to them, the innovation in technology was incredible, world leading. And I remember asking one of them, it was Professor Engel, I said to him, what is your secret to success? And he said, oh, it's really simple. He said, we're 9 million Israelis surrounded by roughly 50 million Arabs who want to kill us almost every day. It's called a thing called existential pressure. And he would say things like, and others would say things like, there is no problem that we cannot find a solution. And I suppose I'm sort of putting this forward, because as I've taken this approach, I think it becomes really important that as we're building alliances, we're looking in the sense, what is it that the view of a people and of a place can be more of a blessing rather than trying to defend itself every day against everything that's opposing it. And I think that that to me is not only far more healthier, but I can tell you that if you're just fighting wars every day, you can get quite exhausted and quite tired. And then you lose sight of what the blessing that you could become to a nation and to its people. And to me, that becomes really important as well. And so one of the things that I think that are really important when we think about indigeneity, we're thinking about culture, but also we're thinking about what are the characteristics, what are the characters of a culture and of different indigenous cultures that can align itself. So there's just 4 key things that I think, I want to leave with you. The first one is a common history and traditions, and many indigenous cultures that you'll see have often had to fight for the right for its identity and who they are. And Israel is no different. The Jews are no different. They're often having to fight for that. So there are common histories and traditions that I think are critically important to that. Common values and principles that I think are really important. The value of family. I love the fact is that I often quote from the book of Malachi, the last book in the Old Testament, where it says then, the prophetic word is about returning the hearts of the children to their fathers and the hearts of their children, the hearts of the fathers to their children. And it's just a wonderful aspect about family becoming really important. In Deuteronomy, such a powerful element of the fact of, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, teach it to your children so they won't forget. And what I loved about being in Israel during the great festivals was just about how that the love and the importance of family coming together. You see, and those things become, and there are so many common values. If you think about Polynesia, and I remember that the Prime Minister during the time when I was a minister, he would say to me, I'm going to go to speak to some Indigenous people. And he said to me, what should I speak about? And I said to him, there are 3 F's you need to have. And he said, the first one is about faith, because faith becomes really important to Indigenous people. And faith is not religion. Faith is not captured in a time and a place. It's about a set of values that you have that you live by every day. So I said, so always talk about faith, always talk about family, because family is critical. That's the cultural construct that holds everything together. And I said, and always talk about the future, because Indigenous cultures are always looking to the future of their children and of the next generation. They are a generational people. What I'm going to tell you, if that ain't connected and common to Jewish values, then I don't know what is. Faith, family, and the future are always critical. The third common characteristic I think it's important is having a common purpose and a sense of mission. What is it that we want to achieve? And like I said, that we want to be a blessing. We want prosperity. We want peace. And if there's anything, and I love that song, Hivenu Shalom Aleichem, we bring peace unto you. And I just believe that there are common purposes and a sense of mission that we can connect with other Indigenous alliances, that people want the same things that Israel wants as well. And then lastly, there are common symbols and boundaries, status and language and rituals. There are so many things that are just so similar in so many different ways that I think that it becomes really important for us that we can do that. And when I think about that, I think about my younger son, Shalom, and he was at university and he rang me up one day and he said to me, Dad, I need you to buy me a silver chain. And I said, wow, Shalom, that's really good. Why should I buy you a silver chain? He said, it's to go with the silver Star of David that I bought in Israel. And I said, okay, so why am I buying it for you? Why are you not buying it for yourself? Well, first of all, I'm a student. But secondly, Dad, because I have seen that many other Jewish students around the world were now fearful of wearing their Star of David because they were criticized, they were assaulted in some cases. And he said, but Dad, that's a symbol of hope for me. I want people to see, and I want to say to them, I'm proud to be who I am. And I said to them, so what happens if you get confronted? And he said, Dad, that's the beauty about being a Polynesian who's 6'2", who's big and solid, right? And they won't hassle me. And you know what I love about that is that, you know, and what we have is that we're imparting into our children, you know, my son and my children will go on to know that this is generational. They'll take on, they'll know what it means. They have been to Israel, they've been to Jewish events that we have here in New Zealand. They know the history, they know the values, they know the sense of purpose that we have as well. And simple symbols that actually mean something to them are also significant as well. And so I just want to say that, you know, those things are what I think are really important. What do we have in common? Again, for us, it's not about being just fighting fires and problems. Actually, it's about presenting the potential of who we are, you know, and to me, I think that's pretty important. And as I've taken that, I suppose that we've seen the success, Sheree and I, and you'll see on the Indigenous Coalition, you know, I want to acknowledge the passing away of the late, we call it kaumatua. Kaumatua is a term of endearment for an elder, an older person who's been a leader, you know, and he had the same thing too. He saw the common history and traditions between Māori and Israel. He saw the values and principles. He saw the purpose and the mission. And he held a vision for 70 years that was given to him by his father, that was passed down from his grandfather, and was simply this. They believed that they had a visitation by an angel, the Archangel Gabriel, that said to him, look after my children, the children of promise and of light. And that was the children of Israel. And that was just after the Second World War. And they'd made the effort to go down to Wellington because they had set aside land. This is how committed they were to this. And in the end, they weren't listened to, and it broke their heart. But they passed this baton down from one generation to the next. And if you see on our Facebook site, just an incredible, wonderful display of a vision coming to fulfillment, a potential that was believed in, and irrespective of that, he held on to that. So I believe that there are so many things that we have in common. I believe there's a wonderful, powerful story. Our narrative is not the negative aspect of what people try to condemn us with. Actually, it's about the blessing that we can become and are becoming in our nations as well. We're seeing it. We have got lots of examples, but I just want to just say thank you so much for giving us the time to share with you, and look forward to some questions.
Thank you. Kol kavod to you, Alfred and Sheree. I'm going to ask Makla now to move into the Q&A, and I want to tell people that we're not going to cut it off at exactly, 5 on the dot, because people have stayed and are very keen to ask questions. So we will continue. We're prepared. I know that our guests have agreed to stay on, so stay with us, and we'll go for as much as 30 more minutes. Makla, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking Andrea and the CAEF for organizing such a really important webinar. And I want a special thanks to our 2 excellent speakers and for their patience. They were wonderful. I had come up with some questions prior to the webinar, and I see that the questions that were being asked basically cover some of the questions that I had worked through prior to that. So, but before getting into the questions, I'd just like to say that Dr. Trotter mentioned Alan Hertz, and I'd like to bring attention to an absolutely excellent, comprehensive article on indigeneity that we have in our book, Zionism and Indigenous Struggle. And he gets into absolutely very, very comprehensive 40-page treatise on this subject. So it's certainly worth reading. I'd like to begin by asking Dr. Trotter, maybe we'll just start that way, and I will speak to you first, ask you the questions first, and then go to Mr. Dinashe. As an Indigenous non-Jewish person, what motivated you personally to stand up for Israel? What is the history of this relationship that you have?
Well, my husband and I, we're Christians, and so we have been on this journey for a long time, maybe 30 years or so, where we started to learn about Israel. We got involved in many different ways. We have a lot of Israelis who come to New Zealand as travellers, so we hosted a lot of travellers, got to know them. We have a Holocaust project where we have interviewed and photographed survivors and created stories. We set up the Holocaust Foundation in New Zealand. So we've been involved on this journey for a long time, and it really started with the fact that we started to look into the scriptures as Christians to understand what is the role of the Jewish people, where do they fit in the scheme of things. So that's really where it's come from.
So how large or significant is the Indigenous New Zealander support for Israel?
Well, as I described to you with the activism of the 1970s, 1980s, there's a large group of Māori New Zealanders who would be pro-Palestinian because it's been built out of that stream of activism, which has been significant for New Zealand Māori community in, fighting for our language, for our rights. So there is quite a large proportion of Māori in that stream, and also the pro-Palestinian movement has been very active in the trade unions, where they have managed to capture a lot of Māori people. But there is a significant group of Māori and Pacific Island people who love Israel, and they tend to be coming from a Christian perspective. Because they're Christians, they see the place of Israel and the Jewish people, and so there is a body of support for Israel from that community.
Mm-hmm. And what have been the consequences for you personally and your family? Has it gotten easier to support Israel? Has it become more difficult? What are you finding?
Well, it's not a popular thing to support Israel, I have to say, but I guess I've been doing it a long time, and I have a lot of friends who know where I come from. They respect it. So, I mean, Israel's divisive. Supporting Israel is divisive, and yeah, some people will stay away from you because of it. Other people will be on the same page as you. Other people just accept that's what you're into. They don't understand it, but they're okay with it. So it's certainly not a popular thing, I would say that.
So, yeah. And how about since the Abraham Accords? Has this made a change, especially amongst the Muslim community in New Zealand?
I have to say, I haven't seen a change as yet in the popular narrative. I think there's a lot of work to be done. And yeah, we just have to keep at it. Yeah, I mean, how do you measure these things? I know there's been a survey done recently to measure anti-Semitism, and it's not looking great. Things are not looking great. Anti-Semitism is on the increase, and most of it is to do with anti-Israel, anti-Zionist sentiment. And this is because of what we see on our news, that it's very biased. It tells one side of the story. It never tells Israel's side of the story. Sometimes there'll be other things that come through, and certainly with, I guess, with COVID and the COVID response, we've seen more news that's been around COVID and what Israel is doing. And in some ways, I think that's been a positive thing, because New Zealand has tended to follow, behind and take note. But it's hard to say whether it's going to make any long-term impact, really. It seems to be just an ongoing battle, really.
Mm-hmm. So what exactly can your Indigenous Coalition for Israel do? What have you been doing? Have you been going into schools? Have you brought Israelis to New Zealand? Have you brought New Zealanders to Israel? What has been going on to try to counter this narrative?
Well, firstly, we've been going 3 months, so we haven't done any of those things in the last 3 months. We're very much in the initial stages of setting up. So, we're at this stage, we're reaching out to other groups, we're trying to collaborate. we helped to facilitate a meeting with the Israeli ambassador and one of the tribes. It was a business innovation meeting. And, you know, that was a way of bringing, and that was quite significant because that particular tribe never welcomed an ambassador onto their meeting house. It was quite a big, important deal for them. So that was one of the things that we've been able to do in the last 3 months. But I guess one of our initial foci is, you know, building up a body material on the website and telling the stories, finding those stories and highlighting them. So we've got a lot of work to do, but we're really just beginning.
And are you going into the schools? Has there been an interest in having speakers come to the schools and you know, speak about Israel, about the history?
Well, potentially, you know, I'm sure that if we had those opportunities, we would take them. And I think that's a great, you know, education is very important. So, you know, that's one of the areas that we'll be looking at.
Mm-hmm. And what's the Jewish community like there? Do you have a representative Jewish community? Small? Can you explain a little bit about the Jewish community in New Zealand?
The Jewish community is very small in New Zealand, and I think that's, you know, probably why the Israeli message has not, you know, succeeded in getting the Israel side of the story out so much, is because, you know, being a small community, there aren't the same resources, people are stretched. So there are a lot of groups working very hard. We have a Zionist organization, we have a group called the Israel Institute of New Zealand who do a great job of advocacy. There are quite a few, well, Christian Israel support groups that do a lot of work in this space. So it's very small and distant, you know, from the centres of Jewish life. And that does make it a bit difficult in the whole advocacy arena. Mm-hmm. It also makes it difficult in that most New Zealanders don't have any sort of concept of who Jewish people are, what they're like, what they look like. And so they tend to adopt the stereotypes that they might get through media. Whereas if you know, have a neighbor or a school friend who's Jewish, then that humanizes the Jewish person. So there's also that aspect, I think, which makes it challenging here.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to switch over to Mr. Ngaro right now and just ask a few questions. I'm very interested about the former Jews who came to New Zealand. Mr. Ngaro speaks, he spoke about the many Maori and Pacifica people who have Jewish ancestry. How does Judaism or identity with Jewish ancestry factor into their self-identity?
Thank you for that question. So a lot of times, a lot of people haven't really connected to either Judaism or to the Jewish community. They know what's inside their genealogy. Like for instance, even on my wife's side, the Rosenquests. So they know the names, but we really haven't, I think, in a way, built the strength of relationship, of understanding, and of culture. One of the, and Sheree and I were at a meeting, it must have been about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, Sheree, and the Jewish community came and they were asking questions to me, and obviously I was in Parliament. They said, how do we address the issues around anti-Semitism, the growing of anti-Semitism? I said, there's two things that I think that are opportunities that we're not taking a hold of. The first one, there are many people like me who have got Jewish ancestry, and like, for instance, on my side, it comes through my father, even though it was my grandmother. So I've been told culturally, in one sense, I don't have that strong connection. And so I said to the community, so there's a large group of people who've got this ancestry, this in their genealogy, but I believe that the Jewish community, and working with others like myself and Sheree, we could see a greater potential of growing the strength of understanding if we were to help people understand how they connect to the community. What does it actually mean? How do you track your genealogy back to actually where What tribe did they come from? Things like that. The second one I said to them is that there's a large group of Christians that actually, and not all, there are some who believe in a form of what they call replacement theology, but a large group of Christians who actually really see, because of their faith, Israel and the Jewish people are actually so important. But because of theology, in one sense, we're disconnected from that community. And that's why when I was saying about the importance about finding what we have in common and using that as a basis to build on. And I believe that started to happen. I mean, our current Israeli ambassador to New Zealand, the ambassador Jacobi, and others, and he's just said to me recently that the places that he finds most acceptance are from the churches and also from the Indigenous Māori and Pacific groups. So it's very interesting so I believe that there's, the answer to your question, I believe there's work to be done. I believe that we can do better. And we're starting to see that. And part of the Indigenous Coalition is in the future to hopefully to be able to grow that as well.
But what are some of the similarities between the Maori and the Pacifica people and Judaism? You mentioned, you talk a little bit about that. You've spoken about that in previous talks. Can you be a little bit more specific? Like is it the value systems that are the same, or are there cultural similarities?
Yeah, I suppose when I was talking about faith being critically important, family, the heart of family, when the great cultural construct of Polynesian people, that's Māori and Pacifica, the family unit is actually the strongest cultural construct. And when you break down the family unit, then you break down the culture and the strength that it has together as well. And also too, they're always future focused. They're always looking at finding solutions, opportunities. So those things, I think, are cultural characteristics that are very much the same. They're very aspirational. They want to be self-determining. The unfortunate thing is, and this is the whole thing around indigeneity, where often it has a negative connotation, because previously I suppose we use the word colonization as a way of actually, it's about power and control. It's taking over, not allowing people to thrive in what they have. And I've seen that, even in New Zealand and even in the Pacific region, where often at times a mainstream culture will try and dominate, often maybe exercise what I would call a token charitable gesture, rather than seeing self-determination of a people, and to thrive in its potential. And so often in those cultures, there's a fight to be able to be self-determining, to determine their future, to have a sense of sovereignty. In other words, to be able to determine, what the rules are, what the purpose and the mission and the vision of a nation and of its people are. Those are things that I think resonate often with when I see that the Jewish culture has, as I've come to experience, and even things when when I've gone to the synagogue, the argumentative culture at times, where they and I know other cultures have it, but in Polynesia, they in certain contexts they will debate the issue quite vigorously and have very strong opinions. I've noticed that even on our chats, we've got people who've got very strong opinions. And so there are some very similar characteristics that I think that's in there. But if I go back to Polynesia in particular, the Bible and knowing, and, we often say, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In places that have transformed parts of New Zealand and Aotearoa, you can go to a marae that's called, if you translate it from Māori to English, it's called Jerusalem. There's another marae meeting house called Judea. And so what has transformed if you want to know the strongest connection, it's that biblical connection to the land and to the people. That is the strongest connection. And I suppose that's why Genesis 12, when we know what the Abrahamic covenant means.
But is this connection to Israel, Is it largely amongst the Christians, the evangelicals who live in New Zealand, or can you see this developing beyond that within New Zealand? From your having been in Parliament, speaking to people, to New Zealanders, where is New Zealand headed? Do you feel, as a Christian, do you feel comfortable living there right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I mean, when you know who you are and where you come from, and you're quite firm in that, those things don't shake you, even though you can have opposition to that. Look, I mean, if I think about it, if I just move into the political area, into the politics of our history as a country, look, there have been things that we've done really well, you know, in our relationship with Israel, and there are things that we've actually done very poorly. It's only just recently we celebrate the Battle of Beersheba, for instance, in 1918, and the Anzac troops were a part of that. And as you know, and Sheree talked about that, that headed on to the Balfour Declaration, and so and eventually to the independence of Israel. The Battle of Ngaro, for instance, just outside of Tel Aviv, where New Zealand can be proud that its soldiers played a part in removing the oppression of the Ottomans. And so there's an Anzac aspect of our history that we can be proud of. But then there are other elements of it. I mean, in 47, the vote for independence, New Zealand was one of the early signatories at that time. But there are elements to our history that I think that we would be ashamed of. That during the Second World War, prior to that, in 1939, there were many refugees from Europe, Jewish refugees, that we did not accept as a country. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think that in my time in Parliament, you know, the resolution that was passed, you know, under our government, when we were in government, many of us were so angry and annoyed because even in our party, political party, there were differing views on that relationship with Israel. And so we currently have a government which I think is more pro-Palestinian than Israel. Now, I can tell you now, that doesn't do anything but actually make us be, rather than being afraid of that, we have to continue to be vigilant. We have to build the base. We need to be engaging with it. We need to get good information. But more importantly, we also need to know what the character of a blessing of a nation will be to others. Because it has to be more than just academic. It has to be more than just, you know, political. It has to be something that people personally engage in and believe in. And so to me, that's part of the shift that needs to happen. In the practical side of things, you know, it's about ensuring that, for instance, in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, I'd like to, and what we were working towards actually having a stronger Middle East branch of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Why? Because it's so poorly managed. Mm-hmm. It's so badly, poorly informed. It brings all this information from the UN. It makes, you know, decisions that we think are wrong decisions on behalf of the majority of a nation that would see the relationship of Israel politically. You know, those things I think are really important. So, you know, it's an ongoing battle, but you have to understand the structure. You have to, and I go back to the first principles, you have to start off from a position of strength, not of weakness. We're not fighting because Israel is poor and needs help, and the Jewish community, and we are believing in a sense of purpose of being a blessing. And it's, from my background in community development, you always start from a position of a strength-based. When we look at our Indigenous communities, they keep using a deprivation index to see all the things that go wrong, and they simply say, well, let's fix those poor people. Rather than saying, what is it about this wonderful people that they have that gives us strength? And out of that strength, that's when you build, you know, the sense of purpose and vision and mission, not from all the things that go wrong. We've got in our institutions, this is where I've begun to see, even at the height of Parliament, when I was in the cabinet, I could see that institutionally there are things that needed to shift and change. So what I want to say to you really clearly, You have to have your first principles right. You have to go into those structures. You have to, in some cases, dismantle what I believe was built on poor foundations, on deprivation, on looking at things as a problem to be fixed and to be solved, rather than an aspirational strength-based approach, and then be able to build differently, especially in our relationship with Israel. And as I say to people, it may be focused on Israel now, but it will also be to our Jewish community, because Israel and the Jewish community are one. They're not separate. It's not a nation and a people that's separate. They are one and the same.
Might we just interrupt for a moment, Michael, just to pick up on that, because one of the things that you probably all know that are listening is we have an audience that is global right now. Many Americans, Canadians, a few Israelis, maybe some Europeans. Are there ways we can collectively address some of the issues that you've spoken of, Alfred, and particularly around anti-Semitism? We, outside of New Zealand, are very concerned that New Zealand has taken an anti-Israel perspective. The polite way of describing it, it's pro-Palestinian, but it's been very anti-Israel, and a vote after vote at the UN, it's frightened us. Canada hasn't been perfect by any means either. Are there ways that we can collaborate in addressing something as significant as how to educate and change the minds of politicians in different places, even if we're, thousands of miles apart?
Sheree, did you want to?
We would value your support to do the work that we need to do here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I feel, a lot of the traditional advocacy work is going on and falling on deaf ears, but that work is important and it needs to continue. But I do feel as an Indigenous group, we have a potential that others don't have, particularly because our foreign minister at the moment is an Indigenous woman. She wears a moko, it's a traditional tattoo. And, one of our goals is to be able to sit down with her, talk to her, talk about the Indigenous position, but also talk to her about her own family history. She's connected to the Kingitanga movement in New Zealand traditionally that supported Israel. So she would be related to the Māori Queen, who organised for a talk to happen about the Jewish connection to Jerusalem, for example. So, this is one of the things that we'd love to do, is sit down with her, have a talk to her, and try to show her the indigeneity of the Jews, the Jewish side of the story. So, we need all the help we can get, basically. So we welcome help with that, definitely, for the local situation.
Well, I just wanted to throw that out. It just seemed like a moment in time that the things you're describing, we're experiencing too. And I think one of the most important things I've learned, having spoken with you and Alfred, is that we, the Jewish community, needs to reach out to our own Indigenous community. And maybe in that regard, you can help us. I have twice written, for example, to the AFN chief, who's the first woman chief, Rosemary Archibald, and she's not responded. So I'm thinking that maybe there's a way that a letter or an overture or something coming from an Indigenous community would help us to have that meeting so we could share this kind of information. So I'm sort of throwing it out, and I'm sure that Makla at CIJR can appreciate that we need to be actively enlarging our alliances, our relationships, and maybe from today forward that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
There's one interesting question that came. There are quite a few interesting questions that came through. It's difficult for me to participate in this and actually see you and read these questions at the same time. But I found this one interesting. It says, about 15 years ago, I had the opportunity to hear the Maori scholar Mason Dury speak about indigeneity at a conference in Australia. I thought his criteria for the status of indigeneity perfectly described the relationship between the Jewish people and Israel, although he never mentioned Israel in his talk. So I wondered, besides yourself, have other Maori scholars and leaders made this link? Have they connected this? Do they speak about Jews and Israel and the connection between the Maori and their ancestors, at least to some of them, in the same way that you're pointing this out?
Historically, yeah. Historically, there is a history of that. In fact, referring back to one of your previous questions, when the first missionary came to New Zealand, his name was Samuel Marsden, he noted the similarities between Jews and Māori. And I mean, I have to say that some of that was anti-Semitic. He noticed that Māori loved haggling, and they loved a bargain, and he saw that as a similarity with Jews. But there were also other practices like washing of hands, you know, around dealing with those who passed away. And he actually wrote up a list of similarities between Jewish and Māori practices. But moving on from that, as I mentioned in my presentation, you know, there were these Māori prophetic movements that developed in the 19th century that were very much inspired by the Old Testament stories, by the and by Israelites, by Jewish history. And some of those religions are still present today. Ringatu is one of them, and they definitely, they see themselves, I think, as part of Israel, as you mentioned, lost tribes of Israel. There are groups of Māori who see themselves that way. I mean, historically, that notion has been debunked, but there are still Māori people who see themselves that way. And there are examples that we know of. For example, with the resurgence of the Māori language in New Zealand in the 1980s, we know of a Māori leader called John Rangiho, who went to Israel and observed what was happening there with the Ulpan, the language schools, and he brought that back. We're told he brought that back to New Zealand and created what we called kohanga reo, or language nests, where children from babyhood grow up immersed in the language. And so, you know, there have been those examples where we've had Māori who have been inspired by Israel and brought things back and developed them. There was also for a period, one of our prime ministers, a Labour Prime Minister Norman Kirk, tried to institute a kind of a kibbutz style system for Māori based on the Israeli model. That one didn't go very far, it didn't work. But again, you know, there's those connections that have been present throughout history. I think, you know, it's been in the last 20, 30 years that the narrative has changed. New Zealand traditionally was very supportive of Israel for the most part, notwithstanding that there were anti-Semitic things that happened. But for the most part, yes. In recent years, that has changed, and I think that's been connected to what I said before about what's happened in academia, the way our current, well, in the last few decades, the way the politicians and the media have been trained to see things. So that's had a real impact, I think. But interestingly, a survey was conducted a couple of years ago, maybe 2017, by the Israel Institute of New Zealand about New Zealand's attitudes to Israel, and actually found that the majority of New Zealanders were favourable to Israel. So this sort of highlights that there's a difference between the media portrayal and what ordinary New Zealanders might think.
Mm-hmm. This is a question for Mr. Ngaro. Were any New Zealand Jews in the military who fought in World War II? And the writer says that his father was a Viennese Jew who fought in the Jewish Brigade in the British Army in North Africa.
So I wouldn't be able to know exactly all the names, but my understanding that yes, there were. Because there were a number of families that were there, but I can't name the family names. But I know that a number of them assimilated into New Zealand society earlier on. There are some books that have been written about the Jewry of Auckland and other cities and in New Zealand, and many of them were Jewish families were involved in philanthropy and education and so forth. So I just so the answer to that question is that. I believe the answer is yes. I don't know the numbers that are significant to that. I just want to quickly say and sorry, I'm actually on holiday at the moment, and I'm in the local vicar's office, so that's why this is not my. And so I'm probably going to have to go soon. But the answer to the question about Andrea, that about the politics, is that you have to be intentional. And so what do I mean by that? People who I've seen who've been intentional to do wrong things have been part of a long plan of whether it be activities that have been designed to try and not only be anti-Semitic, but pro-Palestinian. And so what does that look like, and what could we do together? I know that there, Sheree and I know there's a trust here sponsored by a Jewish philanthropist who's actually just recently passed away. And like Australia, they've actually put together trips to Israel so they can hear both sides politically, so therefore they're better informed. And I think that we can do a better job in regards to those who are going into politics. And I've been talking to other people about how do we equip them with a better set of skill sets to be better for them to understand not only domestic issues, but foreign issues as well. And in particular, the part that I think is important is about the relationships in the Middle East. It's the area that we least put enough effort and understanding, so we understand what those relationships were. And I've been part of those trips with AJAC, which is the Australian equivalent. And when we've been over there, I've seen heard both the Palestinian side, been to the Knesset, but also to have met with some of the PLO leaders. And I can tell you that all of us that came back from that had a much more informed position that we could then speak on in regards to policy, legislation, but more importantly, a political perspective. Now, there's a lot more work that needs to be done inside of that. And I think that there's, some things here that we can do. I probably will need to go now because I've got a family that are waiting out there. The local vicar wants to come back into his office.
That's okay. I'm going to assert my authority over the Zoom license here. So, draw this to a close. We've had a wonderful discussion, and over 200 people stayed until right now. We had over 300 at the beginning, so I think we've done very well. Obviously, people are very keen to understand indigeneity. We are deeply, deeply grateful to you, Alfred and Sheree, for today's talk, for your consideration in presenting, I think, what is a tough conversation for many to have, but also very sensitive and it's very profound, actually, hearing you speak with commitment. And it means a lot to us. It means a lot to Jews to have people stand with us. I will say that on behalf of everybody that's been here today. So thank you again. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Let me remind you that the Canadian Anti-Semitism Education Foundation is a registered charity, and you can help us continue to bring these wonderful programs together by making a donation. Again, thanks to our many sponsors, and thank you, Makla and the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research for participating and partnering with us. I wish everybody a happy day, evening, whichever side of the world you are on. Stay well, and we'll again check in soon. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.